Hi, everyone. My name is Hugo Micheron, and I'm a fellow at the program on extremism at George Washington University. Thank you all for joining. I guess you are not a soccer fan, as we realized that the last round of 16 match was on. So thank you very much for actually choosing this event. I would like to thank, of course, Lorenzo Villino and Seamus Hughes from the program, as well as John Lewis for helping me organizing the events. So it is my pleasure to introduce you our great scholars. So we have the Neymar and Messi and Alex Morgan of research on the topics that we will be addressing today. Which is a matter of great importance. Actually, since the demise of the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq in 2019, a series of publications have shed the light on a largely ignored phenomenon, which is the geographical formation of jihadist hotbeds and clusters in both MENA and Western countries. And in this period, we have, affiliate and splinter groups of both the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda that, of course, remain significant and varied threats. But the idea behind that event is to understand the evolution of this phenomenon over a large period of time. So we will be addressing this issue through Nate Rosenblatt, who is a Foreign Affairs Officer and Strategy Advisor in the US Department of State Bureau of Counterterrorism. Prior to public service, Nate was a postdoc associate at Princeton University's Bridging Divides Initiative, and he completed his PhD at the University of Oxford in 2021. So Nate will be addressing the MENA situation. Then I will be, after his presentation, introducing you to Johannes Saal and his amazing work on German-speaking part of Europe. And then we'll have the pleasure to listen to Noemie Bouhana's work, incredible work on permissive environments and hotbed from a broader perspective, I will say. I will introduce both of them right after Nate Rosenblatt's presentation. Nate, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Thanks so much, Hugo, and thanks to the GW Program on Extremism for convening this. I'm so excited about this conversation. But before I get into why I'm excited and what exactly I've been working on as it relates to this topic, I just want to say that I'll be speaking on my own personal capacity, not on behalf of the State Department. So anything I say will be mostly just based on my individual research prior to joining the State Department. You'll find, I think, some panels get constructed with the eye towards finding points of conflict between different perspectives. I think you'll find in this session a group of people who are in violent agreement with each other. Even though Johannes and Noemie and I have never met, I think I'm really excited about this discussion because we have researched jihadi recruitment in different contexts. As for Noemie also, who's been researching different dimensions of the sort of criminal environment as well, which has a lot of really interesting parallels. But I think we've researched different contexts, but come to really similar conclusions. And I think it makes me excited to talk about it because, I think we as researchers are always trying to find some kind of truth of human behavior, something that is more universal than a particular context at a particular time. And I sort of feel like we've landed on something really interesting that can describe a lot of different phenomena related to high-risk recruitment into high-risk activity. So in this case, it's jihadi activity, but I thought there's a lot of overlap and a lot of interesting comparisons you could draw between this and organized criminal recruitment or domestic insurgent recruitment or rebellious activity. And I'm a sociologist of contentious political behavior. And so I think about, the dimension of terrorism as a tactic that people use to contest power more broadly on a wider spectrum. So I sort of come at it from that point of view. I'll just say, one more thing, and that is, I think, we are, at least for myself, I should say, I'm interested in how, as a sociologist, how groups of people behave. I don't think I'm going to be able to provide you the reason why people join jihadi groups. I don't envy that task, and it is not something that I have set my research up to answer. It's more for me an interest of sort of how people join groups and how those groups form and function. So that's going to be a lot of what I'll talk about today. The problem that I tried to address, starting with my research in 2016, was, when you look at a map of where foreign fighters who joined ISIS had come from in 2016, back at the height of the foreign fighter mobilization to ISIS, over 100 countries, roughly 40,000 recruits. This paradox, when you looked at the map, it sort of looked like fighters had come from everywhere in the world. Every country was some shade of red, and the sort of explanation was, so why are all these countries? Why all these people? And so in 2016, in the spring, a fighter from ISIS in Raqqa fled ISIS territory and escaped into Syria and smuggled a flash drive. And on that flash drive, there was a number of foreign fighter registration forms. And those forms had a lot of detail. Many of you are probably familiar with them, but they asked fighters when they entered ISIS territory and joined ISIS to say where they came from. Some just said their country. Others said a lot more detail than that. And so what I ended up doing with those data was geolocating fighter origins, not just to the countries of origin, but to regions within countries. And so the jumping off point for me from starting this research that I'll talk about in a minute is, when you look at the map of where fighters come from, not just from the countries they come from, but from the places within those countries, you see extreme concentrations. So certain provinces or certain regions of countries or effectively were the sites of the vast majority of the recruitment. So Eastern Libya is a perfect example. So 85% of the Libyan fighters came from 2 regions in Eastern Libya. Central Saudi Arabia was the 3 governorates in Central Saudi Arabia were responsible for about 2/3 of the Saudi recruits to Syria. So the research started with the fact that, we were observing these concentrations of recruits in certain locations. And the question that I wanted to ask myself was why these places? What is it about these places that make them what I called, hubs? In this presentation, I think some people will call it clusters. Hotbeds has been another word used. But for me, what is it about these hubs? And so that led me to the body of work that I've been doing as a researcher since 2016. And so I'll first share some of my overall findings, like why are these places and what's going on there. The second, then I'll talk about a paper that I published thanks to the support of the program on extremism, which was a sort of a deep dive field work into one of these recruitment hubs and thinking about what is going on there and some of my takeaways for what recruitment is like in those places. And then the third thing I'll sort of conclude by just throwing a question into my colleagues here and to all of you for food for thought, is a paper that I did, which was a network analysis of the foreign fighter recruits based on who referred them to join and who facilitated their arrival. And there are some distinct differences between the recruits that joined from the MENA region versus those that joined from Europe. And I know my colleagues here are experts on recruitment in Europe, so I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that, but that will be the end of the presentation. I want to go back to the question of what is it about hubs and why they formed where they formed, and present just sort of, I think, 3 overall takeaways. One is that you sort of see a power law distribution of the places where, so essentially, the vast majority of fighters come from a very small number of places. So in the MENA region, I calculated that about 75% of all the foreign fighters who came from the MENA region, and the plurality of the ISIS fighters came from the MENA region, about 75% of them came from regions that constituted about 10 or 11% of the MENA region population as a whole. So you sort of see this sort of power law distribution. the sort of Pareto principle, the fact that a small number of places were responsible for the vast majority of the consequences. It's observed in a lot of different phenomena. I mean, of course, we sort of understand that naturally is true for rebellious activity or insurgent activity domestically. A lot of work has been done to identify hubs of recruitment for the IRA in Northern Ireland or for Hezbollah in South Lebanon. But the fact that this is also true for people who joined a conflict, for many that was further than they had ever traveled in their life, is a really interesting phenomenon to highlight. So this fact that there's this vast majority that come from a small number of places. And then the next thing that I found was that there are certain structural conditions that make hubs, I wouldn't say make hubs more likely to form, but certain structural conditions that were characteristic of where these hubs formed. One was that they formed in generally poorer parts of wealthy areas of countries. So think in particular sort of poor suburbs of major cities. They also tended to have a higher number of underemployed persons, so people who had university educations but who were generally unemployed. And that's been a finding consistent in a lot of individual level analysis of recruits into jihadi groups. But what I was struck by was that the fact that this was a characteristic of the places where people were recruited from suggests to me that this may not necessarily be the fact that you get a university degree but you can't find any employment. This is a grievance factor. We've seen this a lot in work. But the fact that it's characteristic of the places people are coming from suggests to me that it may not just be an individual motivation, but may be a fact of the community from which people emerge. And I think Noemie's work, where she talks about, I think, the fact that this is a complex interdependent system, that we're talking about contexts, not just people, is, I think, really important to emphasize here. I was struck by the fact that this was characteristic of the context. So in fact, people who come from these hubs may not necessarily be sort of distinct from the general profile of a lot of people who come from particular areas where recruitment is most prevalent. And then in terms of why these places formed for foreign fighting in particular, this is a place I feel like we could talk a lot about, but I'll just say foreign fighting for a lot of people, especially for places where foreign fighting recruitment is most prevalent, I think we should be really careful about how definitive we sort of make the claim that a hub recruited for foreign fighting was always going to be a hub for foreign fighting. What I learned in studying the foreign fighter recruitment hubs that I was looking at was, it was very contingent on a variety of different political outcomes whose outcomes were far from guaranteed. In the Tunisian context, which is where I'll transition to in a minute, which is where the Program on Extremism paper that is linked in the chat came from, what I learned was, the Tunisian foreign fighting mobilization was as much to do with the sort of accidents of post-revolutionary Tunisian politics than it was by any means determinative of the outcome. In other words, the recruitment hubs that we look at for foreign fighting today in retrospect could have just as easily been recruitment hubs for a domestic insurgency had there been a counter-revolutionary coup, as we saw in places like Yemen, as it was for foreign fighting. And it just depended on a small number of people making certain choices at certain times. So those are some of the overall findings. There are some conditions that sort of describe where hubs form, but the fact that they form for foreign fighting is really uncertain. We should be careful about how we determine that. But then I want to dive into some of the findings that I had from actually going and doing field work in Tunisia and looking at what recruitment hubs were like. And that's in the paper that POE is linked in the chat. But basically, I was struck by three things. First, that in recruitment hubs, recruitment into these groups is really easy. It's really easy. It's really easy. It's almost to a certain extent more difficult to say no than it is to just enter into these groups. In the neighborhood that I was looking at, 80% of people surveyed, there were about I think 200 or 300 people in this survey sample of young people in this neighborhood knew someone who had gone to Syria. Of the people that I interviewed who had friends and family go or who themselves tried to go, they were aware of about 30 people who had gone in their neighborhood and in nearby neighborhoods. So the fact that it's so prevalent suggests that it's quite easy to join, whereas I think we think from the outside there's a complicated process. No, sometimes there's an encounter, and it's very difficult to say no in those encounters because the recruitment is so individualized. The second is that recruitment is much more incremental than I think we think. It's like you don't get your membership card on arrival. There's a long process of socialization and indoctrination, and I think Hugo and I were talking about this earlier, but I think one of the things that distinguishes the jihadi movement from other sort of movements into sort of high risk political activism is the fact that the indoctrination process and the recruitment effort is so well developed. There's a curriculum, there's a really careful engagement strategy, and so recruiters are very highly skilled at bringing people along, and so it's both incremental and also quite easy. And the last thing I'll say is that in these neighborhoods where there are a lot of people participating in this activity, a lot of times the relationships are very meaningful, and I don't want to underscore I want to underscore the fact that for people who were involved in a social movement before they were ever involved in a terrorist organization, for some the participation in that social movement was so meaningful, and the relationships that were developed were so important to that individual, that when it came time for one of the group's leaders to choose to participate in terrorist activity or foreign fighting activity, people chose to go with their friends more than they chose to take the action. And it was those choices that came first before the actions themselves. I promised to throw a little question into the group to conclude. And so what I'll just say to conclude is that, the third thing I'll say is that I think linked in the chat, the ArcCiv paper, which is still a work in progress, is a network analysis on ISIS foreign fighter recruits, basically connected by who referred them to join, who facilitated their joining, and the date and time of their arrival. So if you arrived together with this at the same place at the same time with another recruit, you shared a tie. If you were referred by the same person as another fighter, you shared a tie. And if you were facilitated, i.e. you were smuggled with the same person, you shared a tie with another fighter. And so based on those network ties, what I concluded was that there are far more hub and spoke connections in Europe. So one person in the middle of a connection among a bunch of fighters. Whereas in the MENA region for foreign fighting recruitment to ISIS, what you saw was a lot of individuals playing a bridging role. So there were networks connected to networks and big chunks connected to one another. And so my conclusion in looking at that was that, there was a higher degree of scrutiny by law enforcement in Europe than there was in the MENA region at that time for recruitment and mobilization to Syria. And so what I noted from that was that you would build these smaller networks, more localized networks, more hub and spoke networks if you were trying to avoid law enforcement scrutiny and detection, whereas these broader networks, the fact that people could travel all over the country in support of a recruitment effort in the MENA region suggested to me that recruitment was much wider, much more widespread. And to me, it also indicates the offline, online dimension of recruitment, right? That, I think if you see more hub and spoke relationships, you're more likely to see more online recruitment, whereas this brokerage would more likely occur in person. But that's a hypothesis. Both of them are hypotheses that I would be eager to test with better, social media data or better connections to some of these great scholars who work in Europe. Would love to hear your thoughts on that, and thanks for the time.
Thank you very much, Nate. It's fascinating already. So many questions come to my mind. I also would like to remind the audience: do not hesitate to drop questions in the chat box. All right, I will collect them and try to ask them afterwards in the Q&A session. We'll get at least 10 minutes, most probably 15, because there is so many parallels between what you just said, Nate, and the next presentation that we will have now, which is Johannes Saal presentation. So Johannes, you're a sociologist of religion and a political scientist at the Center for Religion, Economy and Politics at the University of Lucerne in Switzerland. And your work as a postdoc researcher at the Swiss National Science Foundation project, Radicals and Preachers. You're also the author of an amazing book which is called the Dark Capital of Jihadists. I would love to hear your thoughts about this cluster or hubs or hotbeds phenomenon for the German-speaking part of Europe. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Hugo, for having me here. Just a moment, I will open the presentation. I think that should work. Does it work? Yes.
Yes, perfect.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, as Hugo already introduced me, like Nate, I'm a sociologist, so I'm mostly interested in social networks. Although often people, I think, confuse nowadays social networks with social media sites like Facebook or Twitter. They can be social networks as well, online networks. But I mostly talk about, as a sociologist, mostly talk about people we are tied to in our daily life, like in our social environment. That can be so-called strong ties to friends or family members, but also for sure weak ties to colleagues, members of your sport club, parents of your kids' friends, and so on and so on. So obviously the social networks of people and individuals, they differ. So some people, they have, for example, more ties. Other people have a higher proportion of strong ties than others, and so on. So in general, these are things mostly depending to social status, socioeconomic background, personality, and so on. As social scientists showed, social networks have actually a crucial influence on our lives, opinions, attitudes, decision, and actions in many ways. So they can be positive as so-called social capital. They can promote well-being. They can promote even health, good health, activities in civil society. That's something like political scientists deal a lot with. But they can also help us to find a new job. But there's also something I call, and other colleagues of mine call, dark social capital, which means that when people are embedded in the wrong networks, studies found they have an increased risk of obesity, for example, of drug addiction, criminality, or in our mattering in our topic, to radicalization. So from the perspective of sociology of religion, this is what I learned, what I trained for. I think jihadi radicalization is not very different as religious conversion processes and the factors behind it. Like several studies in the 1970s, 1980s already found, for example, that people who converted to new religious movements were highly influenced by pre-existing ties, which means that often they only fully accepted the new religious worldview after their ties to in-group members had a higher proportion in their social network than to ties to outsiders. So I think that especially recently this translates very well also in research trends on radicalization, specifically jihadi radicalization or religious radicalizations, which demonstrates that there's an important influence of group-related pull factors, which I think caused some kind of paradigm shift, of which Nate already talked about, that a lot of researchers, especially with a sociological background, started to study the roots to violent extremism instead of the socioeconomic backgrounds and profiles of people involved in this process. So this is what I think in general is called in the academic discussion a relational approach, which I'm obviously following as well in my research. So what I will present now, the results are mostly based on my PhD thesis. I think John will share the link with you in case you're interested to dig a bit deeper. And what I did in my PhD thesis is I basically triangulated several primary and secondary sources. So from court hearings, court trials, documents, social media, to media coverage, and I compiled a data set of actually more than 1,300 jihadi offenders in Germany, Switzerland, and Austria, German-speaking Europe, in the time, or who were active in the time between 1989 and 2018, so about 20 years, which was for itself interesting to see how this movement developed. I will not talk so much about it due to time issues, and I will mostly focus on Germany because this was the biggest part of my sample, with I think 340 individuals. So what you obviously do methodologically with this data is to do some social network analysis, and I followed here specifically temporal and geospatial approaches. So later means I mostly looked on where people located geographically within these networks. So some basic results, firstly, of the social network analysis shows that, first of all, I think jihadism is mostly a collective real-world phenomenon. So on average, for example, people in the German jihadi networks had on average 12 ties to like-minded individuals within this network. And only about roughly 7% had no connection to like-minded individuals. So this isolates, I would say, commonly called in the public discourse, so-called lone wolves, people who are not embedded in any radical milieu or networks. But as I said, it's a small proportion of people. What's also interesting to see, I talked already about the idea of strong ties in sociology. At least half of the sample, half of the inside the sample had strong ties to other jihadis, mostly kindship relations, with a majority of marriage as well as siblings. But there were also a quite high proportion, 25%, roughly 25% of people who had friendship ties. By the way, I think that the actual number is most probably higher because whenever you deal with dark networks, you're facing the problem of missing data. It's something I think every one of us is dealing with, even with the best access to primary source data. What I also said before is already that the size of individual networks differ. So if you map, for instance, the network of Germany, you don't only see, according to the dot sites of individuals, that some of them have more connections than other, but you will also see that individuals with a lot of ties group together. So you see it here quite nicely in the center of this network map. So what I did as a next step was, since these hubs are related to so-called network clusters, which are usually attributed to a specific individual group or physical location, I looked where did the people, I researched in which town or city in Germany they lived, and I mapped it accordingly in a network map. And what you see here now is that you have, for example, some major urban centers like Hamburg, which are, for example, which was temporary home to the 9/11 or some of the 9/11 attackers. Later in the late 2000s, like I think 2 dozens of jihadis left for Afghanistan to join a group called the German Taliban Mujahideen. And also in the last years, it was one of the main recruitment hubs of foreign fighters traveling to Syria and Iraq. But what you will also see, and that's most surprisingly, you have more recently smaller clusters in medium-sized cities where you wouldn't necessarily expect this kind of clusters to emerge. So for example, I don't know how familiar you guys are with German geography. I think even some Germans will probably have problems to locate these places because they're not really well known. But interesting to see is, for example, a place called Dinslaken. They had a whole brigade who was traveling and fighting with the Islamic State. The same in Solingen or Hildesheim. And you also see that if you plot them just in a normal population to cases axis, that there are certain German states with a higher proportion of foreign fighters per general population as well as Muslim population. So I cannot talk so much about it and go into detail what are the characteristics of these hubs, because it would require some more qualitative approach, which I did, but I don't have time now. But there are basically, in my opinion, 3 characteristics, and that's maybe already a point we can discuss later, which are common among these smaller and also bigger hubs. It's firstly the high proportion of strong ties. So all these hubs had a far higher proportion of strong ties than the average. Usually you found some kind of physical meeting place, which most commonly was a mosque, a radical mosque, or a group within a mosque, which was radical. But it could be also more banal, like a gym or a private apartment. But most cases it just was a mosque. And the third point was that usually you had some kind of religious authority, means like some Salafi imam or preacher who was active within this hub. So conclusively, from the research, and that's also maybe some points to discuss later, what I can summarize is that strong ties mostly have a strong influence, strong ties in the form of pre-existing social ties have a strong influence on radicalization itself, as it is the case with religious conversion. Then connected to that, you have creation of mutual obligations, the creation of solidarity, and most importantly, you create trust within these networks, which are essential for high-risk activities. This relates, for example, to the famous prisoner's dilemma, and also a bit to what Nate already told us about the recommendation letters in the Islamic State. So you basically had to have someone who was a senior ISIS member from Germany in Syria who was recommending you to the organization. In regard to weak ties, their function mostly is that they connected hubs trans-regionally. So it's a bit maybe different to what Nate already hypothesized regarding to the West, because from my experience, these hubs I showed, because of the prominent position of, for example, religious authorities and activists and so on, they were well connected through several organizations also, like Dawa organizations, charity organizations. So there was some interconnectiveness definitely between these hubs, which also transpired later in Syria because people met there again, they knew each other already from Germany and so on. Probably connected to that, but also I think even more importantly that these weak ties facilitate the mobilization of resources. So when I talk about the mobilization of resources, I don't necessarily only mean political violence and terrorism, which is only the tip of the iceberg in my opinion. So if you look on jihadi networks in general, you will actually find out that there's maybe even the majority of people not directly involved in political violence and in terrorism. I mean, there is a certain amount of people who went to Syria as foreign terrorist fighters, and these hubs had indeed a very important influence on facilitating their journey to Syria. They provided, what I already said, this tazkiyah, these recommendation letters. They provided logistical support, bought flight tickets, gave recommendations how to reach Syria and so on. But it's only one activity among many. And I think that's that's my conclusive remark, is that it is important, in my opinion, to have a look also on these other activities, which are not necessarily directly related to violence or terrorism as a specific form of political violence, but they include Dawa activities, logistical and financial support. And as a sociologist, I also see that they fulfill basic human needs as the feeling of belonging, acceptance, and recognition. I hope I stayed within the 50 minutes, which is
Yeah,
always a problem for academics.
Perfect, perfect, Johannes. Thank you so much for presenting this. I think there is so many food for thoughts already. So what struck me the most is that first, you kind of show that there is a history behind that geography. I mean, when you mentioned the Hamburg place, for instance, that's very impressive because that's the very place where the 9/11 attacks were prepared, as well as another aspect that struck me a lot, and I'm not sure it's very clear for an American audience, is that most of the places that you showed were actually quite were not the worst of the German region. I mean, most of them were actually some of the most dynamic, economically speaking, region of Germany and arguably of Europe. So the socioeconomic factors on that aspect in Germany seems less important than other factors. And I mean, I think it's part of it, but we cannot reduce jihadism to that. And we cannot reduce, if I got your point well, and it's totally coherent with my own research, jihadism to terrorism. There is, jihadism between two attacks. It exists, and it has a face and some activities related to that. We'll get back to that, but I want to go further in the change of paradigm sort of approach that you guys both mentioned. With listening to Noemie Bouhana's work. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Noemie, you're not a specialist of jihadism. You're working on a different phenomenon from a different perspective, and that's why it's so important to have you here. You're a professor of crime science and counter-extremism at the University College London, and you co-lead there the counterterrorism research group. You also most recently directed the 1 million project, The Social Ecology of Radicalization, which was funded by the United States Department of Defense Minerva initiative. Noemie, we are delighted to have you, and the floor is yours.
Well, hi everyone. Thanks, Hugo, and the program on extremism for having me, especially as Hugo said, since I'm the black sheep of the panel. And please don't ask me questions about jihadism. So I'm kind of a sort of very scattered big picture person. So I study radicalization, but of all kinds. So I study it generally. As a bit of a background, I'm a criminologist, but I'm embedded in the engineering faculty, which mostly means I've been brainwashed in using the word system a lot. And it means that I'm mostly interested in questions about where, and not so much in questions such as who and why, although I'm not saying that they're not worth asking. I'm just saying my niche is more the where. And the reason for that is that studying radicalization as a developmental process, so this sort of biosocial process by which someone comes to see violent extremism or terrorism as something that they could legitimately, morally do. So that's how I define radicalization. You realize that basically there are planets that must align on several levels of explanation. We tend to focus a lot on the individual level, which I call susceptibility. Why is this person compared to that other person susceptible to having, their mind change or being influenced or being made to come to the point where they start to think, yeah, violent extremism, I can do that. And so we have tended to study and still study that a lot. But there are 4 more levels at which, again, certain planets must align for the whole process to unfold successfully. And that's good news because it means that's 4 more opportunities for us to do something and intervene, because if we knock out only one of those levels, the whole process does not happen. So that means we have other things we can do rather than trying to change people. And that's what I call changing context, changing the environment. So after susceptibility, you have selection. People must be exposed to, you guys have all mentioned networks and places and mosques and other things like this. People must find themselves there. They must come into contact with those environments and contexts, and that is through selection. And so where a lot of people, would look at things like grievances, certain emotions, certain motivations as psychological process that turn people to violent extremism, I see them as processes that move people in time and space. If you are angry, you might physically go somewhere, like to the pub, to tell your best friend that you are angry and have a beer so that you feel better about it. And that puts you in a new space where you might make new encounters and be exposed to new ideas. Obviously, I'm making things a lot simpler than they are, but you see where I'm trying to get to. You might go online to a forum to express your anger to a bunch of people, and in that process, be exposed to new ideas and come into contact with new persons. So that's the selection process. Then that exposure to new people and new ideas will happen in settings. And those settings may be, physical, like some people mention mosques. They could be virtual. Some people mention forums. They can be both, you start on the forum and then you move to meeting people in real space. Settings are those very physical places. And then the settings are found in certain environments. Sometimes we say communities, and that's what you might call the social ecological level. Why are those settings where they are? What in the environment around them has made it possible for them to be there, those places where people are exposed to radicalizing teachings and so on. And then at the top, you have the whole system, which explains why the social ecology in certain communities is the way it is, and why that leads to the settings, which lead to the selection, which attract the susceptible people. So you see this whole systemic process means that we have actually a whole lot of levers that we can pull. So my work is trying to understand better those 4 levels, in particular selection, settings, and social ecology, mostly because capturing information about systems is so hard. So I'm starting more modestly to begin with. But when you study cases, so I've done, for example, last year some cluster analysis on radicalization cases in the UK for the Home Office. And what's really interesting is, even without looking for it, 2 kinds of clusters appear. I call one the canary and one the mine. I'm sure you're all familiar with, the story of the canaries in the mine, where, people used to use canaries in coal mines to detect gas. And because the canaries are so small, they're the most susceptible, they're the first one to drop. So I use the canary as the representation of hypersusceptibility. But then there's the mine, and some mines are toxic and some mines aren't. And so you see those 2 sorts of clusters in radicalization cases, some where all the indicators that are more represented are indicators of susceptibility. So the susceptibility seems to have driven the radicalization. You see things like, mental health problems, drugs, prior criminality. You see that a lot. It's probably the number 1 indicator of susceptibility, is having broken the law before. And then in the other cases, you don't see those so much. Those are the cases where people are like, he seemed like a normal guy. I don't understand what happened. Why did this guy radicalize? But in those cases, you see exposure indicators a lot more. So mine a lot more. So maybe they weren't canary types, but they spent so long in the mine, eventually they dropped, right? So and obviously this is a continuum, right? So you have a continuum of susceptibility exposure trade-off, but that suggests that understanding susceptibility is important, but understanding exposure is very important indeed as well, because that's a whole lot of levers. Maybe we can't detect the canaries, maybe we can't stop them from being canaries, but can we do something about the mine? It's basically the logic. So when you study the mine, first you study the settings. And when we think about radicalizing settings, the obvious are things like prisons. So those comes up. Likewise, people say, hotbeds of radicalization relative to prisons and so on. They don't use the word hubs, but it means the same thing. But even I have been inside category A prisons in the UK to do research on radicalization. And what you realize, there's no such thing as prison radicalization. There's a prison at one time that may have a radicalization problem. But even then, once you're inside the prison, you realize it isn't the whole prison. It might be just one wing, or even one part of one wing. And then you realize that if you think about prison radicalization, it sounds like such a big problem. You don't know how to deal with it. But if it's just one part of one wing of one prison at one time, suddenly this is something you can deal with and wrap your mind around, right? And start to think about practical solutions that you could implement. So that's also where I see the social ecological, this where approach useful in helping you breaking down the problem in something you can wrap your mind around. So when you study settings, you also realize that that what we think of as those susceptibility profiles, those susceptibility characteristics, are very context specific. And in fact, someone who is a canary outside the prison might actually be protected against radicalization inside the prison. So that's, I found some cases like this during qualitative interviews with different people inside the prison, because, you know, the canaries, so we're talking mentally disordered, impulsive, antisocial, sexually deviant, long history of violence, etc., etc. Someone you and I would not spend 5 minutes around. Well, the people doing at the time in that prison, what we call the tact offenders, the people who were there under terrorism legislation, also didn't want to spend 5 minutes around these people. And so these people who outside might have been targeted for recruitment, inside were protected against radicalization because their characteristics protecting them from selection for exposure to the terrorist offenders. So again, a canary inside the prison, a canary outside the prison, different things. So it's important to understand that even the susceptibility profiles are context specific. And so when you look at the settings moving beyond prisons, but settings of radicalization in general, so we've done some work, as you said, Hugo, funded by Minerva. And the first thing you find, and the first thing you need to find, otherwise you may as well stop and go do something else, is that the settings concentrates geographically, right? They're not evenly distributed through space. They concentrate in certain parts of the country. And obviously we looked specifically at London because most cases are in London. So to do statistical analysis, it was almost only possible to do it properly in London, but you find the same. You find a high concentration of the settings in London. And once you have found those, what we call hotspots in criminological terms, we have, taken census data, correlated to those hotspots, and found exactly what you would find if you were looking at crime generally and not radicalization in particular. But those are more the places that had radicalization cases tended to have higher population density, more deprived households, more unemployed people, a lot of those sorts of indicators, which I don't have time to go into through all of them, and also more population of non-UK identity, which is the thing that people tend to jump on by saying, oh, well, that's where all the cases are because that's where all the Muslim people are. But the point of doing general radicalization research is that we don't look at just one kind. So we've looked also at the right-wing inspired stuff, and it concentrates as well, and the white people are everywhere. So clearly that's not an explanation on its own. So having done the hotspot analysis, the next thing that we did was a social ecological survey, which is basically where you turn people into boroughs of London, one that has all the radicalization hotspots, one that is matched to a population with similar characteristics, but apparently no radicalization problem, at least not on that level. And you turn people into CCTV cameras and you ask them, what do you see around you? And when we did something like this in London with two London boroughs, so one problem borough and one control borough, again, the things that turned up in the, as statistically significant in distinguishing places where people were reporting having seen in the street groups, extremist groups trying to recruit, versus places where, people weren't reporting this sort of stuff, where your typical, and that will speak, I'm sure, to my sociological colleagues, your typical social disorganization sort of variables, especially things like transience, were reported as highly significant. Those are places where populations tend to move more, right? So all of that was sort of exploratory and sort of suggested that, this approach is worth, digging further into, collecting more data, doing some comparative stuff. We have done some comparative stuff with Aarhus in Denmark, and found some similar findings there as well. We've done started exploring the issue of problem concentration. So the idea being, that those environments are unhealthy, not in a public health sense, although also in a public health sense, but in a general sort of sociological sense. And so they will have other problems. If they have radicalization hotspots, they will probably have crime hotspots. They will have possibly, mental health hotspots and so on and so forth. And we've started with crime, and indeed we found significant correlations with violence. Not interestingly property crimes, but violent crimes. And so, again, this idea that those settings don't appear distributed randomly. There's a reason why they're there in those particular social ecologies. And this where approach, and I will leave it there so there's time for question, but also means that it forces you to, so when we've been all mentioning the online, offline, dichotomy, I just distrust dichotomy on principle alone. I don't think a dichotomy rarely means something. Most things are, continuous. But for example, so when we have done with colleagues in Euros, we've done qualitative work with young people in Euros, because we're interested in the kind of material that they were accessing online. But what I was interested in was not, what kind of material are you looking at? How does it make you feel? Has it changed your mind about anything? Other people are asking these questions. What I wanted to know was, in what circumstances are you accessing this material? Where are you? Who are you with? Right? And it was really interesting to have the kids say, oh, well, it's usually after school, we go to this diner, we put the phone on the table, we look at, this football game, this thing, at some point, someone will say, have you seen this forum? Have you seen this post? Have you seen this thing? And we'll all have a look at it together and chat about it. And that to me is kind of like just a sort of, illustration. Obviously, it's something you generalize, but that suggests that what matters isn't, what's online, that people are looking at it, is what are the effective conditions of socialization in which this exposure will result in the radicalization, in changing people's minds. And we know from all sorts of other things. I mean, there's a reason why universities are switching to blended learning. And it's not just COVID. It's because people have realized that giving stuff online to students and then bringing it back to the classroom and having a sort of social discussion around it with the students mediated by the teacher is the best way to, integrate the material. And that is true for a lot of things, right? And this has been shown experimentally. And that is important because when we think about, counter-radicalization, communication narratives, and so on, we obsess about what to put in the message, but we don't think about how the circumstances in which it will be received, which is a lot more important. And finally, the thing with looking at the environment is that you realize that we're living in a system where the moral ecology is fragmenting into smaller and smaller groups that believe weirder and weirder things. And so what we used to be exposed to one big idea, we're now exposed to a whole bunch. So everybody is talking about, what the fifth wave of terrorism is going to be, because that's one of those things in our discipline, which is, thinking about those waves of terrorism. I don't know if there's such a thing as a wave of terrorism, but I see more and more people writing about, there's different names for it, like salad bar extremism or DIY extremism, or whatever, mixed, unstable, unclear, as they call it on the forum here in the UK. It's when you don't know, or people seem to be ideologically incoherent with themselves. Well, considering the fragmentation of the moral ecology, this is likely to happen more and more. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Noemie, for your presentation. I think what's quite striking is that the idea that the question is not why do people join ISIS or join this kind of radical path, is actually from where are they located, what is the environment surrounding them, and this change everything, because it means we are able to draw a geography of the phenomenon, and based on this maybe start to isolate the factors as you started explaining us. I want to jump on the question side. So we'll get 10 minutes for the question. Will be. I want to ask first a question to Johannes, because I think it will circle in after that. So Johannes, if I read your book the right way, there is something that's quite impressive, is that you show that these places, these hubs that you show, are not, you cannot explain this geography out of the exposure to socioeconomic marginalization, because you've got different places that are marginalized, but that don't provide any ISIS fighters. You cannot solely explain the phenomenon through the size of the Muslim population, the local size of the Muslim population. And what you said is, if I understood correctly, that a relevant indicator is the size of the Salafi milieu within the Muslim population. This will be one of the indicators. First, am I correct? And second,
yes.
can you explain that a little bit further? And I would love to have the take of Nate on this, and then back to you, Noemie.
Yeah, you're certainly right. Thanks for the summary. I think the relation between the size of the Salafi milieu and jihadi radicalization shows for me from a perspective we call economy of religion. So it means you have, I don't know, even within the religion, different branches competing interpretation of religion. And obviously, I think most of us know the typology of Viktorovich between pietist, political, and jihadi Salafis. Although I think later is like a niche within the whole Salafi milieu, but taking it from this market of Salafism idea, how I would call it, then certainly as bigger the Salafi milieu, as higher the proportion, although it's a minority of people who are affected by radicalization. I think another factor, what I already talked about, is the dominance and the existence of religious authorities. Because when we look, for example, at this typology I talked about from Viktorovich, what in our current and my postdoc project we talked a lot about, because we actually do look a lot on Salafi preachers, not exclusively on jihadi preachers, is that that you have preachers which radicalize themselves. Like, I mean, they also radicalize, you know, usually you have the idea of, this preacher is a pietist, this is a political Salafi, and this is the jihadi, and it's something static, but it's actually something dynamic. So you have these cases, like in some hubs I showed here, for example, where you had a Salafi preacher who, when he became active, was not adherent to jihadism, but was preaching some pietist or maybe political form of Salafism. And many, which is interesting to see in Germany, is about these preachers. So there's a preacher network. So most of the preachers knew each other, and they cooperated on dawa activities. They cooperated on charity for Syria, for their fellow brethren in Syria, for example. And the interesting parallel to what happened in Syria is, as soon ISIS, Jabhat al-Nusra, and all the other jihadi groups started to compete more and more, you also had some fragmentation of this Salafi preacher network in Germany. So you had some preachers who radicalized more towards saying that the only acceptable means to realize our worldview is through violent jihad going to Syria. Mm-hmm. And they started to group people around them, inciting them to go to Syria, often not directly, because they were observed by the security service and so on. And they provided them with logistical means to reach these countries.
Thank you very much, Johannes. Nate, what is the importance of the religious factor and the presence of Salafism in the local environment that you've been studying?
Thanks, Hugo. I just want to ask, if we're are we breaking, like, is this an hour session? Because
yeah, absolutely. So it's an hour session, and because it's the French way, we'll be late by 5 to 10 minutes max. But let's try to keep it short. But you know.
Sure. Yeah. No, I just want to make sure that we have the chance to respond to some of the questions that people have asked too. So, but I'll be very brief and say, you know, one of the things that I assumed in finding in my research was that the hubs of recruitment would form in the places with the most charismatic recruiters. And that just wasn't always the case, although it was often the case. So in Bahrain, for example, in the suburb of Manama, Turki al-Ben Ali, the jihadi cleric who became a major ISIS ideologue, you know, was responsible for the majority of the Bahraini recruits, and they came from this particular neighborhood. So the majority of the Bahraini recruits came from a neighborhood with the most charismatic sort of Salafi jihadi preacher. But in other contexts, it wasn't always the case. In Tunisia, for example, the fact that Ansar al-Sharia, the group that formed before as a precursor to the sort of departure of many Tunisians to Syria and Iraq, they basically created a traveling, you know, Salafi jihadi scholar curriculum, and the major clerics would travel all over the country and meet lots of people in different places, and that those individuals became important brokers. But their recruitment was most prevalent in places where those clerics were not necessarily from, you know. So I think it's it's a fact that is true in some cases. As with a lot of recruitment, the answer is it depends.
Thank you very much. Do you want to jump on some of the questions that were asked, or do you want, or we go to? Okay, let me ask one question to Noemie, and then like a question to all of you to wrap it up. Noemie, I mean, you addressed it in your presentation, but I would love to have maybe your take a little bit deeper on that aspect. It's the radicalization sort of notion. That was actually a question that was asked by the audience. What do you think of that notion? Do you think it's a useful tool to approach the dynamics that you've been studying, or do you think that the radicalization notion or concept is actually not as useful as it has been considered in the past?
Well, it's not. I find it a very imperfect notion, which is why the first thing I did was translate it in criminological terms. And so I do what a scientist does when I write a paper. I say, for my purpose, that's what it means, you know. But it's true that often I read other papers and I don't really know, do they mean, for one, I don't understand another dichotomy I can't wrap my mind around is cognitive versus behavioral radicalization. What does that mean? You know, behavioral radicalization is, so basically you're talking about, you know, terrorism or acts of violent extremism or some kind of behavior of some kind, right? So then say that. And if cognitive radicalization, so you mean a psychological process, right? So say that. So no, I don't find it terribly useful, mostly for the reason that people often don't take the time to define it when they're using it. So for me, I always say, you know, it's the process by which someone acquires the propensity to commit violent extremism. That's it.
Thank you so much.
Because in criminological term, propensity has a very precise meaning. We have tools to measure it, and I need tools to measure things.
Thank you. And actually, I want to jump on that to ask like one question to all of you guys that will sum up part of the question that we're asking the audience. We understand perfectly what are the intellectual implications of you know, changing the shift from, you know, individual cases to a geographical approach. My question now is, what will be the policy implication? Like, what will it change? What your approach will bring that will be new tools to address these kind of extremist phenomenon? Maybe we can start with you, Noemie, and go backward to Nate, and then end up with Johannes.
Well, like I said, generally it means it opens up the sort of interventions you can consider. So we focus a lot on, counter-radicalization and so on, as in, changing the minds of people, but you can also change environments, right? So settings I didn't have time to go into this, but all radicalizing settings have 4 or 5 dimensions that they all have in common. If you can act upon those, then you undo the radicalizing power of the setting. So you can focus on just settings and not people. More specifically, for example, right now I'm being commissioned in the UK by the Home Office to develop a risk assessment tool or framework. We have plenty, to assess objectively individual susceptibility. We don't have a single one to assess susceptible or permissive environments. So I'm doing that right now, developing a tool like that.
Thank you. Nate?
It's very hard to sum up a lot of this stuff, Hugo, but I'm going to do that by trying to respond to Kevin and Lena's questions about community conditions and the question of radicalization. I'll say none of our words in this field are very good. It's a complex system and it's a complex topic, and I don't think our words do a lot of justice to sort of distilling this phenomenon. But I think radicalization is a sometimes unhelpful and oft overused term. First, I think it's relational and it's not objective, but I think more importantly for this conversation, and it's relevant to Casey's question, Kevin's question, excuse me. Ultimately, from a policy point of view, what you want to be able to do is split the actors and their actions from the communities from which they emerge, and focusing on the ideas that motivate those actors over the actions themselves risks alienating the wider community from the society, rather than alienating the bad actors, which is ultimately what you're trying to do. And what I mean by that is, if we think about this as a radicalization problem, from the point of view of the people who are from these communities, who don't generally, my findings are that, the individuals who get recruited out of these communities where there are hubs aren't necessarily distinct from the sort of general profile of individuals from these communities. They're more reflective of the dynamics in those communities. So, overeducated and underemployed persons come from communities that are generally shut out of economic and political and social opportunities. They're discriminated against, they don't have representation, they don't have fair access to markets. It's even physically hard for them to leave these neighborhoods and travel across the urban environments where they're usually coming from. So what I mean by, so from their perspective, right, contentious political behavior is really is an outlet to express a frustration that many in the community share. And so when you focus on the frustrations that people have that come out of those communities, you are in effect saying to a wider number of people who are supporting these efforts, even though they're not actively participating in them, that the ideas and the frustrations that motivated the actions are also wrong. It's not necessarily the intention of the person who's sort of saying these sorts of things, but ultimately it's received in these communities in that way. And so my recommendation is always to focus on the actions and to split those actions. Like, it's understandable that you're frustrated with conditions because they are so poor, but blowing people up in the center of the city isn't going to advance those causes. And when you focus on those actions, you find you'll, in the communities where recruitment is most prevalent, a wider number of allies who will support you and ultimately help you, push to the margins these ideas. I don't think radicalization is a good term for us to sort of advance that effort, but I think ultimately, from a policy point of view, that is the thing you want to find traction on, which is getting the community from which these hubs are emerging to support an effort to undermine the recruitment of young men and women to those kinds of outcomes.
Thank you very much, Nate. And Johannes, the final words are for you. What will be the recommendation that you had?
I've got a lot of responsibility now. If it comes to policy advices, I conclude from my research. First of all, I think you need to surely differentiate between counterterrorism, extremism, and prevention. And although I think prevention is, I think, the more cost-effective way to deal with this issue, I will mostly now talk about counter-extremism, terrorism. So what you do after you already had the problem or you have currently the problem. So what my research showed, or what worked in the German case was, at least for many places, not for all. And I know it's a politically rather sensitive issue as well as legally, because it competes with basic democratic rights like freedom of religion, for example. But what actually really worked was closing down radical mosques and prosecuting radical preachers, especially in these medium-sized towns I talked about, because you took basically the whole infrastructure. It's not maybe a measure which always works, especially in bigger places. I mentioned Hamburg, for example. They closed down mosques several times. People went to Afghanistan or Syria, they died there, they were arrested and so on. But there were always, in these bigger places, always enough seats, you know, to make, to let networks grow again. That's on the group level, on the geographical level. On the individual level, what I see in my research is that I think if you want to de-radicalize a person, like whatever you understand about de-radicalization or radicalization, but let's take the common understanding of the word. If you want to de-radicalize a person, I think you need to follow a holistic approach, which refers to many aspects of life, because getting involved in Salafism and Jihadism is a life-changing experience, and not just the network matters that people suddenly only have their social ties to like-minded people, but their whole all-day life is centered around these activities. They usually don't go to work anymore. So by the way, that's something interesting, because I don't think that all people are necessarily unemployed before they're radicalized, but during the radicalization, because they say suddenly, my work is not adequate, or it's not fitting to my Islamic behavior and religious understanding. Anyway, so what I often see, for example, about returnees from the Islamic State, they indeed are sometimes highly traumatized and dissatisfied with what happened in Syria and Iraq. They felt also often betrayed by leaders, and they also verbalized that in confessions, in the courts process, and so on. But as long they don't cut all the ties to radical networks, what I usually see is that it's kind of like a drug addict who is who's falling back for his addiction. So I don't know if the comparison is fitting one-on-one, but that's sometimes how I see. And that brings me also a bit back to the idea of radicalization, which we often see as a linear process. I think it's, and I'm sorry, Noemie, I know you don't like the term waves, but I think it happens sometimes for a lot of individuals in waves. You know, there's some, especially up and downs in the beginning of radicalization. I know people who were also for a long time in the radical milieu, and still this one weekend each month they go to Amsterdam to smoke pot, and then they come back to Germany to their Salafi friends, and they adhere to all the strict rules of Salafism. So, and I think that's also really important to see regarding de-radicalization, because this is my experience from returnees or people who actually actively seek to leave these networks, that it's not always successful, specifically when they're still in touch with like-minded people.
Thank you so much. I wish we have like more time, like at least 15 minutes, but let's take it as a sort of a kickoff event, and I'm sure we'll have plenty of rooms to discuss about your works. Thank you, Johannes, Saal. Thank you, Neymar, Rosenblatt, and thank you, Noemie, Alex, Morgan, Bouhana, for being here today. You were great, no injuries whatsoever, and
no yellow cards either.
You could have said Kilian.
Thank you everyone for coming too.
It was a pleasure. Thank you everyone, and keep in touch for discussing further this issue. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Hugo.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.